The night sky over London erupted in a hellish ballet of searchlights, tracer fire, and the thunderous roar of German bombers on September 7th, 1940. The city that had stood for nearly 2,000 years now faced its most severe test. But among the chaos, the fire, and the destruction raining down from above, one man would emerge as an unlikely hero. His name was Sergeant George Teasdale, and his official designation in the British Army was nothing more glamorous than clerk. Yet over the course of 10 extraordinary nights during the Blitz, this unassuming soldier would accomplish what seemed impossible, downing 30 enemy aircraft with the same 3-man anti-aircraft gun. This is not a tale of fiction. This is not Hollywood embellishment. This is the documented, verified account of one of the most remarkable defensive actions of World War II, a story that challenges our very understanding of what ordinary men and women were capable of when their nation faced its darkest hour. To understand how a clerk became one of Britain's most effective gunners, we must first understand the world he inhabited in the autumn of 1940. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. France had fallen in a stunning 6-week campaign that shocked the world. The British Expeditionary Force had barely escaped annihilation at Dunkirk. Now, with the Royal Air Force bleeding personnel and aircraft in the skies over southern England, Adolf Hitler and Hermann Göring prepared to unleash their fury upon British cities in a campaign designed to break the will of the British people. The strategic thinking behind the Blitz was deceptively simple. If you could not defeat the Royal Air Force in daylight combat, you would attack by night, when the advantage shifted decisively to the aggressor. If you could not invade Britain across the English Channel, you would attempt to terrorize its population into submission, and if you could not break the British military, you would target the industrial capacity and civilian morale that sustained it. George Teasdale had not expected to find himself on the front lines of this new kind of warfare. Born in 1917 in the industrial heartland of Birmingham, he had grown up in a world still recovering from the previous world conflict. His father had served in the trenches of the Western Front, and young George had heard the stories, the nightmares made verbal, of mud and wire and the sound of artillery that never stopped. When war came again in '39, George enlisted not out of idealism or patriotic fervor, but out of a simple understanding that this was what was required. His administrative skills, honed through years of clerical work in civilian life, saw him assigned to duties that were critically important, but far from glamorous. He processed paperwork, maintained records, ensured that the vast bureaucratic machinery that sustained a military at war continued to function. It was essential work, but it was not the work of warriors, or so it seemed. The anti-aircraft defenses of Britain in 1940 were a curious mixture of the sophisticated and the makeshift. The country possessed some of the world's most advanced radar technology, stations dotted along the coast that could detect incoming raids with unprecedented accuracy. But the guns themselves, the weapons that would actually bring down enemy aircraft, were often outdated designs, some dating back to the First World War. Ammunition was precious, fire control systems were primitive by later standards, and training was often rushed as Britain scrambled to build its defenses against the aerial onslaught. The 3.7-inch anti-aircraft gun that would become George Teasdale's instrument of defiance was typical of these weapons. It was a heavy piece, requiring a crew of at least 3 men to operate effectively, though the full crew complement was 7. It could fire up to 25 rounds per minute when pushed, though sustained fire at that rate was punishing, on both the weapon and the crew. The shells it fired weighed 28 pounds each, and when they detonated at altitude, they created deadly clouds of shrapnel designed to tear through aircraft structures and crew members alike. Operating such a weapon at night against bombers flying at 15 to 20,000 feet with minimal assistance from searchlights or fire control systems was extraordinarily difficult. The gunners had to estimate altitude, speed, and direction, then calculate where the aircraft would be by the time their shells reached that altitude. It was as much art as science, a deadly form of prediction that required not just technical knowledge, but an almost intuitive understanding of aerial combat. When the Blitz began on that September evening, George Teasdale found himself reassigned. The anti-aircraft batteries defending London needed every man who could be spared, and clerical personnel who had basic weapons training were being pressed into service. George reported to a gun position in East London, an area that would bear some of the heaviest bombardment of the entire campaign. His crewmates were a loader named Thomas Briggs, a 22-year-old dock worker from Poplar, and a spotter named Arthur Walsh, a 34-year-old former railway worker with a wife and 2 young children evacuated to the countryside. They were not elite soldiers. They had not trained together for months. They had minimal time to familiarize themselves with their weapon before the first raid arrived. Yet somehow, in the crucible of combat, they would forge themselves into one of the most effective gun crews in the entire defense of London. The first night was chaos incarnate. The German bombers came in waves, their engines creating a distinctive asynchronous drone that Londoners would come to know and dread. The Heinkel 111s and Dornier 17s approached at high altitude, visible only when caught by searchlights or silhouetted against clouds reflecting the fires below. The sound of anti-aircraft fire was constant, a thunderous percussion that shook buildings and set off car alarms across the city. George's gun crew joined the barrage, firing into the night sky with desperate determination. The mathematics of anti-aircraft fire were brutal. Even under ideal conditions, it could take thousands of rounds to bring down a single aircraft. Most shells exploded harmlessly, creating spectacular but ineffective light shows. The gunners were not trying to hit aircraft directly. That was nearly impossible. Instead, they aimed to create zones of shrapnel-filled airspace that bombers would have to fly through, hoping that the law of averages would eventually work in their favor. But something remarkable happened during that first night of sustained combat. George Teasdale, the clerk who had spent most of his military career behind a desk, discovered that he had a gift for the deadly calculus of anti-aircraft fire. Perhaps it was his mind, trained through years of administrative work to process complex information quickly and accurately. Perhaps it was some innate spatial awareness that had never been tested before. Whatever the source, George found that he could track the bombers more effectively than most, could judge their altitude and speed with uncanny accuracy. Around 1 in the morning, as fires raged across the East End and the bomber stream continued its relentless assault, George's gun scored its first confirmed victory. A Heinkel 111 caught in multiple searchlight beams suddenly shuddered as shells from George's gun detonated near its port wing. The aircraft's engine burst into flames, and the bomber began a spiraling descent. The crew managed to abandon the stricken aircraft, their parachutes opening in the hellish glow of the burning city below. The bomber itself came down in the Thames, creating a spectacular waterspout that was visible for miles. For Thomas and Arthur, this was a moment of exhilaration and relief. They had actually hit something. They had proven that they were not merely making noise, not just expending ammunition in a futile gesture. But for George, it was different. He had seen something during that engagement, understood something about the patterns of flight, the way the bombers moved through the night sky, and he believed he could replicate it. The second night brought more raids, and George's gun crew claimed 2 more bombers. The third night, another 3. By the end of the first week, they had 7 confirmed victories, an almost unheard-of success rate for a single gun crew. Other positions in the area were beginning to notice. Officers were asking questions. How was a gun crewed by a clerk, a dock worker, and a railwayman outperforming positions manned by professional soldiers? The answer lay in a combination of factors that military analysts would later study in detail. George had developed a firing method that differed from standard doctrine. Rather than firing continuous barrages in the hope of creating killing zones, he carefully observed each bomber, tracked its flight path, and fired short, precise bursts at calculated points. He was, in effect, treating each engagement as a mathematical problem to be solved rather than a chaotic melee to be endured. Thomas, the loader, had developed extraordinary speed and efficiency, keeping the gun fed with ammunition even during the most intense moments of combat. His hands moved with mechanical precision, grabbing shells, loading them, clearing the breech, repeating the process with barely a pause. On several occasions he sustained minor wounds from flying shrapnel, but refused to leave his position, understanding that the gun crew functioned as a unit, and removing any member degraded their effectiveness. Arthur, the spotter, had the most difficult job. In the chaos of a night raid with searchlights sweeping the sky, fires creating updrafts and smoke that distorted visibility, and dozens of aircraft overhead, he had to identify targets, call out their positions, and help George track them. He developed a shorthand communication system with George, using minimal words to convey maximum information, allowing them to work with almost telepathic efficiency. By the 10th night, September 16th, the crew had achieved something extraordinary. They had claimed 30 confirmed victories with several more probables that could not be definitively verified. 30 German bombers, each carrying tons of explosives intended for London, had been brought down by a single gun crew operating the same 3.7-inch weapon night after night. The cost had been severe. All 3 men were physically and mentally exhausted. The constant noise, the vibration from the gun, the stress of combat, the knowledge that thousands of Londoners were perishing in the raids they could not stop, all of it extracted a terrible toll. Thomas had lost 15 pounds. Arthur's hand shook uncontrollably when he was not actively engaged in his duties. George had developed a persistent ringing in his ears that would never completely fade. But they had also achieved something that transcended mere statistics. They had proven that the anti-aircraft defenses were not impotent, that the bombers were vulnerable, that even in the darkest hours of the Blitz, Britain could strike back. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. For the civilian population enduring the nightly raids, the sound of anti-aircraft fire was both terrifying and reassuring. It was terrifying because it meant the bombers were overhead, but reassuring because it meant Britain was fighting back. The story of George Teasdale and his crew must be understood within the broader context of the Blitz, that campaign of aerial bombardment that lasted from September 1940 to May 1941. During this period, German bombers attacked British cities virtually every night, with London bearing the brunt of the assault. More than 40,000 civilians perished, over 1 million homes were destroyed or damaged, and entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. The strategic purpose of the Blitz evolved as the campaign progressed. Initially, it was intended to destroy the Royal Air Force and establish air superiority as a prerequisite for invasion. When that failed, it became an attempt to destroy British industrial capacity and war-making potential. Finally, it devolved into what amounted to terror bombing, attacks designed purely to break civilian morale and force Britain to negotiate peace. It failed on all counts, but not because it was not devastating. The Blitz caused enormous suffering and destruction, but it did not break British resolve, did not cripple British industry, and did not prevent Britain from continuing the war. Part of the reason was the extraordinary courage and resilience of the British people. Part of it was the effectiveness of civil defense measures, the fire brigades, the air raid wardens, the rescue services that worked tirelessly to save lives and maintain essential services. And part of it was the anti-aircraft defenses, the gun crews like George Teasdale's, who made the German bombers pay a price for every raid. The Luftwaffe lost over 600 aircraft during the Blitz, along with their crews, men who could not be easily replaced. These losses, combined with the strategic demands of Operation Barbarossa, the planned invasion of the Soviet Union, eventually led to the scaling back of the Blitz in the spring of 1941. The 3.7-inch gun that served George Teasdale so well was itself a weapon with an interesting history. Developed in the late 1930s as Britain belatedly recognized the need for modern anti-aircraft capabilities, it represented a compromise between firepower, mobility, and ease of manufacture. It was not the most powerful anti-aircraft gun in service. That distinction belonged to the larger 4.5-inch weapons, but it was reliable, relatively easy to produce, and could be deployed in numbers. The shells it fired were time-fused, set to explode at a predetermined altitude calculated by the gun crew. This was an imprecise science at best. The fuses were mechanical, subject to variations in quality and environmental conditions. Setting them required quick mental calculations under extreme stress. Too short a fuse, and the shell exploded harmlessly below the target. Too long, and it exploded above or beyond the target. Only a fuse set with near-perfect accuracy would detonate close enough to the target to cause damage. George's particular genius lay in his ability to make these calculations rapidly and accurately. He developed mental shortcuts, ways of estimating altitude and timing that allowed him to set fuses with remarkable precision. He studied the bombers, learned their performance characteristics, understood how they behaved at different altitudes and under different conditions. He became, in effect, a specialist in aerial geometry, treating each engagement as a unique problem to be solved. After those 10 extraordinary nights, George Teasdale's war continued, though he would never again achieve the same concentrated success. The German tactics evolved. The bombers began flying at higher altitudes beyond the effective range of the 3.7-inch guns. They employed more sophisticated electronic countermeasures. They varied their approach routes and timing to make prediction more difficult. And the anti-aircraft defenses themselves changed, with new guns, new fire control systems, and new tactics being introduced. George was eventually promoted, his clerical skills combined with his combat experience making him valuable in training and organizational roles. He helped develop new firing doctrines, taught other gun crews the techniques he had pioneered, and contributed to the steady improvement in anti-aircraft effectiveness that occurred as the war progressed. By the end of the war, the percentage of enemy aircraft brought down by anti-aircraft fire had increased dramatically, though it never became the decisive weapon some had hoped. Thomas Briggs, the loader, continued to serve with anti-aircraft units throughout the war. He participated in the defense of Malta, one of the most heavily bombed places on Earth, where his experience and skills were desperately needed. He survived the war and returned to dock work in London, though he rarely spoke of his experiences. Like many veterans, he found that the gap between what he had lived through and what others could understand was too vast to bridge with words. Arthur Walsh, the spotter, was less fortunate. He was reassigned to a different gun crew in early 1941 and was caught in a direct hit during a raid on London in March of that year. He passed away along with his entire crew when a German bomb struck their position. His widow received notification via a standard form letter, one of thousands sent during those dark days. His children, who had been evacuated to safety, never saw their father again. The story of George Teasdale and his gun crew raises fascinating questions about the nature of warfare and human capability. How much of military success is attributable to training and doctrine, and how much to individual skill and intuition? The British military in 1940 had standardized procedures for anti-aircraft fire, developed by experts and based on the best available knowledge. Yet a clerk with no special training managed to exceed those standards dramatically simply by approaching the problem differently. This speaks to something fundamental about innovation under pressure. When organizations face existential threats, they often discover that their formal procedures and hierarchies are less important than they thought. Individuals with no special credentials or positions emerge as leaders and innovators. Skills that seemed irrelevant suddenly become critical. The rigid structures that work in peacetime become liabilities in war. George's background as a clerk, far from being a disadvantage, may have been key to his success. Clerical work requires attention to detail, the ability to process information quickly and accurately, and a methodical approach to problem solving. These were exactly the skills needed for effective anti-aircraft fire. The physical demands of operating the gun were significant, but they were not the limiting factor. The limiting factor was the mental calculation required to predict where a moving target would be when a shell reached it several seconds after firing. The psychological dimension of their achievement is equally remarkable. Night after night, these three men operated their gun under conditions of extreme stress. They were surrounded by death and destruction. They could see and hear the results of bombs falling on their city. They knew that every bomber they failed to stop might carry the explosives that would end the lives of their friends, families, and neighbors. The weight of that responsibility, combined with physical exhaustion and the constant danger they themselves faced, should have broken them. But it did not. They developed coping mechanisms, some conscious and others unconscious. They focused on the technical aspects of their job, treating each engagement as a problem to be solved rather than a life or death struggle. They supported each other, covering for moments of weakness, maintaining morale during the worst times. They found meaning in their actions, taking pride in their growing tally of victories, even as they understood the human cost on both sides. The ethics of their actions deserve consideration. The German bomber crews they brought down were not evil men by any reasonable standard. They were, for the most part, ordinary people pressed into service by a regime they may not have fully supported. Many were conscripts, flying because they had no choice. When George's guns brought down a bomber, the crew members who survived the crash were often young men, sometimes teenagers, terrified and injured and far from home. Yet the moral calculus of war is not about the individual enemy soldier, but about the system of violence they serve. The bombers George brought down were carrying weapons intended to cause mass civilian casualties. Every aircraft destroyed meant lives saved on the ground below, perhaps dozens or even hundreds of lives, depending on what targets the bomber had been assigned. The gun crews did not have the luxury of philosophical reflection. They had a job to do, and they did it with skill and determination. The technical evolution of anti-aircraft warfare during World War II is a fascinating study in military adaptation. At the start of the war, anti-aircraft fire was largely ineffective against high-altitude bombers. Guns were manually aimed, fuses were hand-set, and fire control was rudimentary at best. By the end of the war, sophisticated radar-directed systems could track and engage targets with unprecedented accuracy, while proximity fuses that detonated automatically when near an aircraft dramatically increased hit probabilities. George Teasdale's methods represented an intermediate step in this evolution. He could not replicate his success systematically because much of what he did was instinctive, based on pattern recognition and spatial awareness that he could not fully articulate. But his example inspired efforts to understand and codify what effective anti-aircraft fire looked like, leading to improved training methods and tactical doctrines that benefited gun crews throughout the British military. The social dimension of the Blitz provides important context for understanding the significance of the anti-aircraft defenses. For civilians sheltering in basements, underground stations, and purpose-built shelters, the sound of anti-aircraft guns was psychologically crucial. It represented active resistance, a refusal to simply endure the bombardment passively. Even when the guns were largely ineffective, which was often the case in the early months of the Blitz, their sound provided comfort and maintained morale. This psychological role of the anti-aircraft guns created pressure on commanders to maintain high rates of fire even when ammunition was scarce and the probability of hits was low. There was a tension between the military imperative to conserve resources and use them effectively, and the civilian morale imperative to demonstrate active defense. Crews like George Teasdale's helped resolve this tension by proving that anti-aircraft fire could be genuinely effective, not just a morale-boosting gesture. The impact on German bomber crews should not be underestimated. Flying night missions over heavily defended cities was extraordinarily stressful. The anti-aircraft fire, even when it did not result in direct hits, created an environment of constant danger. Bombers could be damaged by near misses, forcing them to abort their missions or making them vulnerable to night fighters. Crew members could be wounded by shrapnel, reducing the aircraft's effectiveness, even if it remained airborne. And the psychological stress of flying through anti-aircraft fire night after night led to combat fatigue and reduced efficiency. Every bomber brought down by anti-aircraft fire represented not just the loss of an aircraft and its crew, but also an impact on the morale and confidence of other crews. When bomber groups returned from raids with empty positions in their formations, when crews failed to return and their fates remained unknown, it created an atmosphere of dread that no amount of training or ideological indoctrination could fully overcome. The technological competition between offense and defense during the Blitz drove rapid innovation on both sides. The Germans introduced new navigation aids, allowing their bombers to find targets more accurately in darkness and poor weather. The British developed new radar systems, improved searchlights, and better fire control mechanisms. Each advance by one side prompted a response by the other, creating a cycle of innovation that accelerated the development of technologies that would have broader applications later in the war and in the post-war period. George's personal experience with this technological evolution was somewhat limited. He operated a relatively simple weapon system, and his success came not from technological superiority, but from skill and determination. Yet he was part of a larger system that was constantly adapting and improving. The intelligence gathered from bomber wrecks, the analysis of German tactics, the development of new procedures and training methods, all of this fed into a process of organizational learning that eventually made the anti-aircraft defenses far more effective than they had been in the early days of the Blitz. The 10 nights during which George Teasdale achieved his remarkable tally also saw some of the heaviest bombing of the entire Blitz. September 7th through 16th, 1940, was a period when London burned on a scale that had not been seen since the Great Fire of 1666. The East End, where George's gun position was located, was particularly hard hit. The docks, warehouses, and industrial facilities were prime targets, and the densely packed residential areas surrounding them suffered devastating collateral damage. The civilians in these areas lived through conditions that are difficult to fully comprehend today. They endured nightly raids that could last for hours, during which hundreds of tons of high explosives and incendiary devices rained down on their neighborhoods. They emerged from shelters each morning to scenes of devastation, entire streets reduced to smoking rubble, bodies being pulled from collapsed buildings, fires still burning out of control. And then they went to work, cleared debris, maintained essential services, and prepared to endure another night of bombardment. In this context, the success of gun crews like George's was not just militarily significant, but symbolically vital. It demonstrated that Britain was not helpless, that the enemy could be hurt, that resistance was not futile. The psychological impact of this on civilian morale cannot be measured precisely, but it was undoubtedly substantial. People drew courage from knowing that every night British guns were firing back, and that sometimes those guns found their mark. The broader strategic situation in September 1940 adds another layer of significance to these events. Britain truly stood alone at this point. The Soviet Union was still bound by its non-aggression pact with Germany. The United States remained neutral, though increasingly sympathetic to Britain's plight. The British Empire provided resources and manpower, but the defense of the British Isles rested primarily on British shoulders. The successful defense against the Blitz, though costly in lives and property, was strategically decisive. It prevented Hitler from achieving the air superiority necessary for an invasion. It maintained Britain as a base from which the eventual liberation of Europe could be launched. And it demonstrated to potential allies and enemies alike that Nazi Germany could be resisted successfully, that the apparently unstoppable Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe had limits. George Teasdale and his crew were, in one sense, minor actors in this grand drama. They were three men operating one gun in a city defended by hundreds of such weapons. Yet their extraordinary effectiveness, their refusal to be overwhelmed by circumstances, their daily demonstration of skill and courage under fire, embodied the larger story of British resistance during this crucial period. After the war, George Teasdale returned to civilian life and to clerical work. He did not seek publicity or recognition. His military service was documented in official records. His decorations were modest but genuine, and he was content to have played his part. In the decades after the war, as historians began to examine the Blitz in detail, his story gradually emerged as one of the remarkable individual narratives from that period. The 30 confirmed victories achieved by his gun crew in 10 nights remains one of the most impressive defensive achievements of the entire Blitz. Various historians and analysts have studied the records, verified the claims against German lost records, and confirmed the essential accuracy of the account. What makes it even more remarkable is that it was achieved with equipment and methods that were not substantially different from those available to hundreds of other gun crews. The difference lay not in technology, but in the men themselves. This raises a question that extends beyond military history into broader questions about human potential. How many other George Teasdales were there? People with extraordinary abilities in specific domains who never had the opportunity to discover or develop those abilities. How many potential innovations, solutions to difficult problems, leadership qualities remain undiscovered because circumstances never created the conditions for them to emerge? War, for all its horror and waste, sometimes reveals human capabilities that peacetime obscures. It forces individuals into situations where they must perform beyond what they thought possible, and sometimes they discover that they are capable of remarkable things. George Teasdale did not know he had an intuitive genius for the complex mathematics of anti-aircraft fire until circumstances forced him to discover it. The 3.7-inch anti-aircraft gun that served George so well was eventually superseded by more advanced weapons. Many were scrapped after the war, though some remained in service with various militaries into the 1950s and even 60s. A few survive in museums, silent testimony to a period when Britain's survival depended on weapons like these and the men who operated them. The site of George's gun position in East London has changed beyond recognition. The devastated neighborhoods of the Blitz were rebuilt, often with modern housing estates and commercial developments. The exact location where George, Thomas, and Arthur fought their nightly battles is now occupied by ordinary buildings, home to people who may have no idea of what happened there more than 8 decades ago. Yet the memory of what they achieved deserves to be preserved and understood, not because war should be glorified, but because the story illustrates something important about human courage, skill, and determination in the face of overwhelming adversity. It shows that individual excellence can make a difference even in the midst of vast, impersonal military campaigns. And it reminds us that heroes are not always born. Sometimes they are made by circumstances, by necessity, and by a refusal to accept defeat. The broader lessons from George Teasdale's story extend into many domains. In military terms, it demonstrates the importance of individual initiative and adaptation, within organizational structures. The British military did not order George to develop his unique firing methods. He did so because he saw that standard procedures were not yielding optimal results, and he had the freedom and the courage to experiment. In human terms, it illustrates the extraordinary capacities that emerge when people are tested by extreme circumstances. George, Thomas, and Arthur were not superhuman. They were ordinary men who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and rose to meet the challenge. They suffered from fear, exhaustion, and stress like anyone else, but they mastered those feelings sufficiently to perform their duties with exceptional skill. In historical terms, the story provides a window into the experience of the Blitz from the perspective of those who fought back. Most accounts of the Blitz focus on the suffering of civilians or the courage of rescue workers. These stories are important and deserve to be told. But the story of the anti-aircraft gunners who fought a largely invisible war in the night sky, trying to protect their city from the bombers overhead, is equally important and often overlooked. As we look back across more than 8 decades to those 10 nights in September 1940, we see a story that is both specific and universal. It is specific in its details, the technical aspects of anti-aircraft fire, the particular circumstances of the Blitz, the individual personalities of the men involved. But it is universal in its themes, the courage of ordinary people, the importance of skill and determination, the capacity of humans to adapt and excel under pressure. George Teasdale, the clerk who became one of Britain's most effective anti-aircraft gunners, returned to his ordinary life after the war and lived quietly until his passing in 1983. He did not seek fame, did not write memoirs, did not campaign for recognition, but his story, documented in military records and verified by historical research, stands as a remarkable testament to what one gun crew could achieve during Britain's finest hour. When the sound of anti-aircraft guns echoed across London on those September nights, when thousands of civilians huddled in shelters, hoping to survive until dawn, when the city burned and the future seemed uncertain, 3 men stood beside their gun and fought back with skill, courage, and determination. They could not stop the Blitz. They could not prevent the suffering and destruction that would continue for months. But they could, and did, make the enemy pay a price. They proved that Britain would fight back, that the bomber offensive would not go unopposed, that even in the darkest hours, resistance was possible. 30 confirmed victories in 10 nights. 1 3.7-inch anti-aircraft gun. 3 men who refused to accept that their situation was hopeless. This is the story of George Teasdale and his gun crew, a story of skill, courage, and defiance that deserves to be remembered as long as we study the history of World War II and the defense of Britain during its most desperate hour. The legacy of those 10 nights extends beyond the immediate tactical success. It demonstrated principles that would be applied in anti-aircraft defense throughout the rest of the war and beyond. It showed that training and doctrine, while important, must be balanced with the freedom for skilled practitioners to adapt and innovate. It proved that even outdated equipment, when used with sufficient skill, could remain effective against more modern threats. Most importantly, it provided a human story that encapsulated the larger narrative of the Blitz, ordinary people doing extraordinary things, a nation refusing to surrender despite overwhelming pressure, and the triumph of courage and skill over raw force. This is why George Teasdale's story matters, not just as a military curiosity or a footnote to history, but as an enduring testament to human capability when tested by the most severe circumstances imaginable. As the searchlights swept the London sky and the guns thundered their defiance, as George called adjustments and Thomas loaded shells with mechanical precision, as Arthur spotted targets and called them out, they were not just defending a city. They were defending an idea, the belief that free people have the right to determine their own destiny, that tyranny can be resisted, that courage and skill can prevail against apparently overwhelming odds. This was their gift to their generation and to all the generations that would follow. And in the quiet streets of modern London, where peace and prosperity have replaced the fire and fury of those terrible nights, we owe them the debt of memory, the obligation to remember what they did and what it cost, and the determination to ensure that their sacrifice and their achievement are never forgotten.